So we were going to look at Exodus chapter 34, verse 29.
Oh, 34?
Exodus 34.
Not 24?
Exodus 34,
30.
verse 29.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, ma'am.
When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the two tables of the covenant in his hand as he came down from the mountain, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. And when Aaron and all the sons of Israel saw Moses, behold, his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the congregation returned to him, and Moses talked with them. And afterward, all the sons of Israel came near, and he gave them in commandment all that the Lord had spoken with him in Mount Sinai. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil on his face. But whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he took the veil off until he came out. And when he came out, he told the sons of Israel what he was commanded. The sons of Israel saw the face of Moses, but the skin of Moses' face shone. And Moses would put the veil upon his face again until he went in to speak with them. So the shining face of Moses and the shining face of Jesus. I mentioned when we were reading the three gospel passages that Matthew has only the bright cloud. So he wants to emphasize the brightness of the cloud, even though a bright cloud doesn't usually make a great deal of sense. But so what is the bright cloud?
A symbol for heaven.
I'm sorry, what, Mary?
A symbol for heaven. Or God. God, actually.
It's called the Shekinah. It's the cloud of glory that accompanies the presence of the Lord. So remember in Exodus, the glory cloud accompanies the Israelites. It leads them by day and is behind them and rests with them by night, right? That the Shekinah cloud of glory. So wherever God appears, there should be a glory cloud, and that's called the Shekinah. So that's a really important part of the Israelites' experience in the wilderness. So the Shekinah.
How do you spell that, Shekinah?
Shekinah.
Thank you.
Second Maccabees chapter 2 verse 8 says the glory of the Lord will be seen in the cloud. So we have the Shekinah. Then a voice comes from the cloud saying, listen to him. That basically is in the Old Testament, there are only two places where God speaks from a cloud, the cloud, explicitly. Let's look at them in Exodus again. It's chapter 24, verse 16. It doesn't say what God said, but then Moses went up on the mountain, and the Lord and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day, he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Chapter 34, verse 5. And the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in mercy and faithfulness, keeping merciful love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. So the voice comes from the cloud and it says, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Does listen to him sound familiar?
Oh, that's when Mary said at the wedding at Cana?
Yes, she did. Yeah, although that's not the listen to him.
That's not it.
that Matthew is trying. There's something similar in the Old Testament. That's actually interesting, since Peter and James and John were almost certainly at the wedding at Cana, but probably Matthew hadn't been recruited yet, since he was slightly later in Jesus' ministry. So he probably wouldn't have had firsthand experience of the wedding at Cana. So Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15.
Chapter 18.
Verse 15.
Which 18?
Deuteronomy.
18, 15?
So the Deuteronomy is the book of the law in which Moses is dictating the Mosaic law that he's received from God. And given the experience of the Israelites in the wilderness, there's a concern with their faithfulness to the covenant and with their tendency to lapse into idolatry. So that's reflected in starting in verse 9, when you come into the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. And it goes on through verse 14. And then in 15, there's a prophetic line. We've read it a number of times. It's worth keeping in mind. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brethren. Him you shall heed, just as you desired of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, or see this great fire anymore, lest I die. So him you shall, a prophet like Moses, him you shall heed. So this is typologically a reenactment of Sinai with God's voice, that Jesus is the prophet like Moses and that he should be heeded. So very much like the Israelites became afraid, and even Aaron became afraid when Moses approached them after coming down from the mountain because of the radiance of his face. The disciples became afraid when seeing the radiance of Jesus' face. So then the Transfiguration is a type of Moses' encounter with God on Mount Sinai. So does anyone remember when we discussed typology? Typology is based on a similarity of context, but on an escalation, so that there's a certain continuity in a typology. There's also discontinuity. So what is the discontinuity? What is the escalation? Does anyone have any idea? So on the one hand, using typology here, Matthew is saying that Jesus is the new Moses, that Jesus is the promised prophet like Moses. But if there were no escalation, then Jesus would just be a second Moses, right? But instead, Jesus is not
So
only
the
the new Moses, but
escalation, oh, okay. Sorry. No,
no, I'm sorry, go
so the
ahead.
escalation is going from a prophet to the Messiah. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah, and how do we know that in the Transfiguration? Jesus is presented both as the new Moses, but also as something greater than Moses,
The Son of God.
the Son of God, right? So how does that, how does the vision depict that? One of the things is obviously the voice, which says, "This is my beloved Son."
Right.
And the cloud.
Well, the
He's
cloud
on-
was there before, but the brilliance,
Yeah.
the shining face or shining body, how is that different?
Well, it's clothing too.
Right, clothing as well. So the brilliance affects not only the brilliance, the inner brilliance of Jesus also is reflected in his clothing. So what else? Where does Moses' brilliance come from?
God.
From God, right? It's reflected. Moses has no brilliance of his own.
Right.
He just simply absorbs radiance from being in God's presence. It's sort of as if he had been, exposed to nuclear radiation, and now he goes about disseminating the radiation that he received until it wears off. Right? He himself is not the source of the brilliance or of the light. But with Jesus, it's different. Jesus is the source of the brilliance and light. That's Jesus and true light that's being revealed.
So it's coming from within.
Coming from within Jesus, and it's not imposed on Jesus from without. So that's a significant typological difference. Incidentally, the point of typology here, and the reason that typology is used so extensively is that the basic understanding of typology is that God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And so that God tends to do the same things over and over again in salvation history. So there's a basic similarity of context when God does those things, but there's an escalation because there are discontinuities, and God is, if you want to put it that way, raising something to a new level. So Moses leads his people from bondage in Egypt into freedom and into the promised land. And Jesus leads his people into a proper relationship with the Father so that they can become sons and daughters of the Most High God, and so that they can inherit eternal life. So there's a similarity of context and yet an escalation. The freedom that Jesus is leading his people to is qualitatively different than the freedom that Moses is leading his people to. Moses is leading them to a very physical freedom in a very physical world, and Jesus is doing that as well, but there's much more. So, any other things in terms of Jesus being something greater?
Why did you say it was 6 days was real important?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Why did you say 6 days was important to Matthew?
The cloud appeared for 6 days before Moses was summoned before
Okay.
God.
Oh,
So 6 days, 6 days. There's, a slight. They don't completely correspond, but typological equivalents often don't perfectly correspond. So at Sinai, Moses is the subject of revelation, right? God communicates to Moses the Mosaic law and what he expects of the people of God. But that's not what happens here. Here, the disciples are the recipients of the revelation. The transfiguration is really occurs for them so that they can understand better who Jesus is, that he's the Son, that they can understand better what it means that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of the living God. So both at Sinai and the Sermon on the Mount, Moses and Jesus are the lawgivers. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is giving the law of the new covenant rather than the Mosaic law or the law of the old covenant. But here Jesus is revealed as the Son of God. And then finally, at the end of the vision, Moses disappears, as does Elijah. So Matthew emphasizes leaving Jesus himself alone. So himself is reflective, designed to emphasize the Jesus, the fact that Jesus is alone. So Jesus takes the place of both Moses and Elijah and supersedes them. So is that all clear?
So that's why they were there?
Uh, that's part of why they were there. Yeah.
I don't think you talked yet about like why they're there yet. Why are they there? I mean, you're talking about similarities, but why Elijah is there?
Why is Elijah there? Because
Yeah, now it seems really clear why Moses is there, right? Because we can.
why what?
I said, now it's clear why Moses is there. You explained all
Right. So why was Elijah there?
typology.
I think it's
Elijah is
because both of them were prophets, right?
No.
Elijah and Moses.
yeah. I mean, although
Moses.
Moses is most closely associated with the law rather than the prophets. Moses is the giver of the law, although
Mhm.
he also can be considered the greatest of the prophets, with Elijah being the second greatest of the prophets.
Mm.
Remember, we've read from Malachi before that Elijah is to come again,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
So let's look at Malachi, which is the last of the prophetic books of the Old Testament. It's Malachi chapter 4, verse 5. We all there?
Malachi 4.
4, verse 5.
I only have Malachi 3.
That's me too.
It's, in that case, I think it's at the end of 3.
Yeah, where it says Moses and Elijah, verse 22.
Uh-huh. Behold, so let's start at 4. Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and ordinances that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Horeb is Sinai. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a curse. And the same verse is repeated in the book of Sirach in chapter 48, but it adds to restore the tribes of Israel as part of the prophecy. So Elijah is there then as a representative of the prophets, right? And Elijah, as the disciples subsequently asked Jesus, they ask, isn't Elijah supposed to come? So Elijah is prophesied to come at the end of time, at the great and terrible day of the Lord, when the people of God, the Israelites, will be spared, hopefully spared, or if they don't turn to God, then the land will be stricken with a curse. So Elijah represents the promise to return at the end of time and represents the prophetic tradition. So in the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah disappear, right, leaving Jesus. So, as almost all of the fathers pointed out, the Transfiguration represents Moses and Elijah. In the Transfiguration represent the law and the prophets, and they meld into Jesus, who's the only one left standing, who supersedes both. So Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets and supersedes the law and the prophets. So, questions about that? That interpretation starts with Origen, who wrote, Moses, the law, and Elijah, the prophet, had become one with the gospel of Jesus. They did not abide as they formerly were as three, but they became one. So that suggests that, are there any questions about that? So that suggests that the Transfiguration also, besides being a type of Moses' encounter with God on Mount Sinai, that it also has an apocalyptic or an eschatological element. Some of that is very clear in the fact that it looks forward to the second coming, that it's a glimpse of the glory of Christ as he will come in judgment at the end of time. So it looks forward to Jesus' future glory. It gives a glimpse of what eschatological resurrection means. And so in that sense, it's prophetic, but it's also typological and points to the present before the resurrection, before the second coming. Does anyone have any sense of how that might be?
How it points to the present.
How it points to Jesus' ministry, and it points to Jesus' death and resurrection as being eschatological. Any ideas?
Well, it shows Jesus, how Jesus will look in his kingdom also.
Uh-huh.
His divinity.
And what about before the second coming?
Hmm.
So we have many of the same typological elements, for Moses and Mount Sinai are also elements in apocalyptic revelation. So mountains also tend to be a place of apocalyptic revelation. Um, voices of God, angelic voices are often common in apocalyptic visions. They're typically described as visions, as Jesus himself describes the Transfiguration. And typically the reaction to a vision is fear, as the disciples reacted. There's a belief that at the end of time, the bodies of the righteous would undergo transformation and become glorious and luminous, and their garments would glisten. Does anyone remember in the book of Revelation, the garments washed white in the blood of the Lamb?
Mm-hmm.
So those are glistening garments. It's an eschatological and apocalyptic image. And so Jesus here then is providing a prototype for what believers will become. It was also believed that at the end of time, God would come and tabernacle among his people.
Mhm.
And so we've seen from the quotation from Deuteronomy and Malachi that God is to send a prophet like Moses to inaugurate the end time. God is to send a prophet like Elijah, or is to send Elijah again to turn the hearts of fathers toward their sons and sons to their fathers and bring restoration for the end time. So Moses and Elijah have melded into Jesus. So there's only one person who fulfills the prophecy about Moses and about Elijah, who fulfills those types typologically, and that's Jesus. So that means that in Jesus, the day of the Lord has been realized. We've discussed that before as an important theme in Matthew. So the day of the Lord has come. So there are two eschatological events. There's Christ, his ministry, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, his establishment of the church. That is an eschatological event. It's the entry of God into human history. That is the day of the Lord by definition. And then, so that's called realized eschatology by theologians. And then there's future eschatology. Future eschatology is the second coming of the Lord, when the Lord comes in judgment and when there will be a new heaven and a new earth. So the Transfiguration points to both of those. It points forward to the second coming, but it also points to Jesus and his ministry as realized eschatology, as the entry of God into history, and as the dawning of the day of the Lord. So with Jesus, a decisive moment in salvation history has been reached, and it will be reached again when Jesus comes at the end of time. The cloud is also significant in this kind of eschatological vision. The expectation in Jesus' time is that the cloud, the Shekinah, would return at the end of time. We can see that if we look at Isaiah chapter 4, verse 5.